Inflation. It's the silent tax on wealth that almost no one escapes. In Turkey, prices have soared more than 33% in a single year. In the UK, inflation sits at over 4%, eating into wages and savings. In the US, it's around 2.7%, still high enough to erode household purchasing power. In Canada, 1.7%, better, but still a strain on families and retirees. And in Australia, despite being one of the world's most resource-rich economies, households are still battling rising living costs. But here's the twist. In Singapore, a country smaller than New York City, inflation is so low it barely makes the news. And that's not by accident. While economic giants wrestle with price instability, Singapore has quietly built one of the world's most trusted financial systems, protecting both citizens and global investors from the erosion of wealth. So the question is this: how did Singapore outsmart inflation while others still struggle? And what does it reveal about the future of money, trust, and economic power? This way, Australia is in the headline contrast, giving your Aussie audience recognition, while still keeping Singapore as the star. After Section 1, Inflation as a Threat to Wealth. To understand why Singapore's achievement is so remarkable, we first need to understand inflation for what it really is. It's not just a number in an economics report, it's a slow drain on wealth, savings, and investments. In the UK, families are watching grocery bills climb week after week, while wages barely move. That gap is shrinking disposable income and forcing people to eat into their savings. In the United States, even as interest rates rise, most households still see their money lose value. The return on a savings account rarely keeps up with the cost of living. In Canada, inflation has collided with an already overheated housing market, leaving middle-class families struggling to balance mortgage payments with everyday expenses. And in Australia, despite being one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, workers say their paychecks no longer stretch as far as they once did. This is why economists often call inflation a hidden tax on wealth. Unlike income tax, you don't see it deducted on your paycheck. Instead, it shows up in your supermarket receipt, in your rent, in your retirement account losing value year after year. Inflation punishes savers. It weakens confidence in local currencies, and it creates uncertainty for both ordinary families and global investors. And then comes Singapore, the outlier. While much larger economies struggle to protect their citizens' purchasing power, Singapore has turned stability into its greatest strength. By keeping inflation under tight control, it hasn't just protected household finances. It has positioned itself as a safe haven for capital flows, wealthy families, and multinational investors searching for a place where money can hold its value. Section 2. Singapore's Playbook. Singapore doesn't fight inflation the same way most countries do. In the United States, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to slow spending. The Bank of England follows a similar approach, using borrowing costs to squeeze demand out of the economy. But Singapore takes a completely different path. Instead of adjusting interest rates, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, its central bank, manages inflation by controlling the value of its currency. The strategy is simple on the surface, but incredibly powerful in practice. By allowing the Singapore dollar to strengthen against other currencies, imports become cheaper. And in a country that imports more than 90% of its food, fuel, and raw materials, that makes all the difference. This approach protects the purchasing power of households, while giving investors and multinational corporations confidence that costs will remain predictable. Section 3. Why investors trust Singapore. Inflation control isn't just about keeping prices steady, it's about trust. And this is where Singapore stands apart. For decades, the country has built a reputation for financial discipline, political stability, and long-term planning. That consistency matters, not just to citizens buying groceries, but to global investors managing billions of dollars. In London or Washington, monetary policy often swings with politics. Elections shift priorities. Debt crises push governments into short-term fixes. The result? Investors worry about volatility, and ordinary families worry about whether their money will hold its value. Singapore doesn't have that problem. Its monetary authority has one of the strongest reputations in the world for independence and competence. Rules don't change overnight. Policy isn't dictated by populism. The system is predictable, and in finance, predictability is power. That's why Singapore has become a magnet for capital flows, wealth management firms, and high net worth individuals searching for stability. Private banking assets in Singapore have surged, and multinational corporations use it as a hub to manage regional operations. For the wealthy, Singapore isn't just another financial center. It's an insurance policy against global uncertainty. And that trust isn't accidental. It's the result of decades of careful design, where economic policy is treated less like politics and more like engineering, precise, deliberate, and built to last. NAV's Section 4, the trade-offs. Of course, Singapore's strategy isn't perfect. Strengthening the Singapore dollar makes imports cheaper, but it also makes exports more expensive. That means local manufacturers face tougher competition abroad, and tourists often complain about high costs when visiting the city-state. In a global economy where cheap exports fuel growth for countries like China or Vietnam, Singapore chose a very different path. The trade-off was clear. Prioritize financial stability over export competitiveness. For a country positioning itself as a wealth hub, this decision makes sense. The government understood that the long-term benefits of attracting foreign capital, investment funds, and multinational headquarters would outweigh the short-term pain of weaker export margins. This is why Singapore today looks less like a traditional export economy and more like a financial fortress. The city-state markets itself as a place where money holds its value, where investors can trust the rules won't suddenly change, and where wealthy families can safeguard their assets from global shocks. It's a conscious choice, one that very few nations are willing or politically able to make. While others gamble with short-term growth, Singapore doubled down on stability, even if it meant higher living costs for foreigners and a tougher landscape for local exporters. Section 5, Lessons for the World. So what can larger economies learn from Singapore? In the United States and the United Kingdom, inflation control is often slowed down by politics. Election cycles force leaders to focus on short-term wins rather than long-term planning. Raising interest rates becomes the default solution, even if it hurts borrowers and small businesses. The result is a constant tug-of-war between politics and economics, and trust in the system erodes. Canada and Australia face a different problem. Their economies are deeply tied to housing markets and commodities. When global demand shifts, these nations feel the shock almost immediately. Inflation isn't just about domestic prices, it's about exposure to external risks. And without Singapore-style discipline, families end up vulnerable when costs spike. Singapore shows that size and natural resources don't guarantee stability. What matters is a clear playbook, long-term planning, credible monetary policy, and a willingness to prioritize wealth protection over short-term growth. Here's the irony. Singapore is smaller than New York City, with no oil, no farmland, and no natural resources to fall back on. And yet, it manages its economy with the precision of a global investment bank. While bigger nations debate and delay, Singapore acts, and the results speak for themselves. The lesson is simple. Inflation isn't just about economics. It's about discipline, credibility, and trust. And in a world where money is constantly losing value, Singapore has turned stability into its most powerful asset. Conclusion. Why Singapore wins. Inflation isn't just a number. It's the invisible tax that eats away at savings, erodes purchasing power, and destabilizes societies. From London to New York, from Toronto to Sydney, families are asking the same question. Why does everything feel more expensive? And the answer often comes down to one thing: leadership. Singapore has no natural resources, no vast land, no army of voters demanding quick fixes. What it has instead is discipline, a system built on trust, long-term thinking, and the courage to do things differently. While other countries fight inflation with half measures, Singapore protects its wealth by design. That's why the world's wealthy move their money here. That's why multinational firms set up headquarters here. And that's why, in a time of global uncertainty, Singapore doesn't just survive, it thrives. The question every other nation should be asking is simple. If a tiny city-state can control inflation, safeguard wealth, and win trust on the global stage, what's stopping us?